There are people in this world who look at an old woman with a carry-on bag and see nothing worth respecting. They see gray hair and sensible shoes and a face that has lived too long and achieved, in their estimation, too little. They make a decision in under 3 seconds. And sometimes, not often enough, but sometimes, that decision destroys them. Miriam Oyelaran had been traveling alone since her husband passed 11 years ago. She didn't make a fuss about it. She booked her own seats, packed her own bag, called her own cabs. At 68, she moved a little slower through airport terminals than she once had, but she moved with the kind of quiet certainty that comes from a woman who has buried a child, rebuilt a company, and still managed to show up every Sunday morning to make jollof rice for whoever happened to need it that week. You don't get that kind of stillness from a comfortable life. You earn it. The morning everything happened, she was flying out of Vancouver International on a direct flight to Toronto. She had a board meeting the following afternoon, the kind that required her physical presence, not a video call. She had been on dozens of these flights. She knew the gate, knew the process, knew to arrive early enough to have a cup of tea before boarding. What she didn't know, and couldn't have anticipated, was that the man behind the airline counter that morning, a ground operations supervisor named Derek Holloway, had woken up in a foul mood and had apparently decided the rest of the world should share it. She noticed him the moment she approached the priority boarding lane. He was standing slightly apart from the other staff, arms crossed, surveying the queue the way a man surveys, something that is mildly inconveniencing him simply by existing. He was broad-shouldered, mid-40s, with the practiced look of someone who had spent years in a position of small authority and had mistaken it for something larger. Miriam set her carry-on bag down beside her and reached into her coat pocket for her boarding pass. Derek Holloway's eyes moved to her, then to her bag, then back to her, slowly, in a way that was not exactly rude but was not exactly anything else either. "Priority lane," he said. Not a question. "Yes," Miriam said. She held out her boarding pass. He didn't take it immediately. He looked at the bag again. It was a well-made bag, dark navy, rolling handle, nothing flashy. Exactly the size the airline allowed for carry-on. She had checked this, as she always checked this, before leaving the house. "That bag looks oversized," he said. "It's within your airline specifications," she said. Still pleasant. She'd had this conversation before, or variations of it, and she had learned a long time ago that pleasantness was armor. He stepped forward, took the bag by its top handle without asking, and set it against the measuring frame bolted to the counter. The bag fit comfortably, with room to spare. He did not apologize. He simply turned back and said, "You'll need to check this." Miriam looked at him. "I'm sorry, the bag. It's going to cause problems in the overhead compartment. You'll need to check it." "The bag is within specifications," she said again, still calm, though something in her chest had gone very still in the way things go still before a storm. "I've just watched you confirm that. Policy gives us discretion," he said. "I'm using it." The people in the priority lane behind her had gone quiet. A few were watching. One woman near the back had her phone half raised, hesitating. Miriam did not raise her voice. That was the thing people who didn't know her always missed about her. She didn't need to. "I have medication in that bag that I need access to during the flight," she said. "And I have a legal right to carry it on board. We have medical staff on the ground in Toronto," he said. And the ease with which he said it, that flat dismissive ease, was the thing that made 2 or 3 people nearby inhale sharply. "I'd like to speak to your manager," Miriam said. "I am the manager on shift," he said. And then he did something that nobody standing in that line would forget. He bent down, unzipped the front pocket of her carry-on, without her permission, without asking, without any justification under any airline policy that any of them would later be able to identify, and began removing items. Her reading glasses case, her small zippered pouch of medication, a paperback novel with a bookmark in it. He set them on the counter in a loose, careless pile, the way you might unpack a grocery bag when you're looking for something at the bottom. Derek. One of the junior staff members, a young woman, said his name very quietly from behind the counter. He didn't look up. "We're not checking this in," Miriam said, and now her voice had changed in a way that was hard to describe. It hadn't gotten louder. It had gotten denser, like something very heavy had moved underneath it. "You are going to replace those items, and you are going to do it right now. Ma'am, you have not given me a single reason that complies with this airline's stated policy. You have handled my personal belongings without consent, and you have done it in front of a line of witnesses." She gestured, a small, controlled gesture, to the people behind her. "I am going to ask you one more time to return my items and allow me to board." Derek Holloway straightened up, and here is where it gets interesting, because you could see it on his face, the moment where he made a choice. He had two roads in front of him. He chose the wrong one. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, and his voice had dropped into something low and mean, "but I have the authority to remove you from this line entirely. So I'd suggest, Derek." The voice came from his left. It was not loud either, but it had a quality to it, the kind of quality that certain people develop after years of being the person in the room that other people answer to. The young woman behind the counter was looking at someone approaching from the corridor that led back to the airline's operational offices. She was not looking at Derek, she was looking past him, and her face had a particular expression on it, the kind that is not quite fear and not quite relief but is somewhere in that neighborhood. The man who walked up was about 55. He wore a jacket with the airline's insignia, the kind that indicated regional management rather than ground crew. His name badge said Thomas Achi, Senior Director, Western Canada Operations. He walked the way people walk when they are very used to the fact that rooms pay attention when they enter them. He had been passing through the terminal on his way to a separate gate. He had seen the tail end of what happened with the bag. He had stopped. He looked at Miriam's belongings on the counter. He looked at Derek. Then he looked at Miriam, and something shifted in his face. "Mrs. Oyelaran," he said, "I apologize." Derek Holloway turned. And the thing that happened to his face in the next 2 seconds was, there is no other word for it, extraordinary. The color did not drain from it so much as it collapsed, like a building whose supports have been pulled out from under it. Because Thomas Achibi was not simply a director at the airline. Thomas Achibi was, professionally speaking, one of the people who answered to Miriam Oyelaran's board of directors. The airline had, 2 years prior, entered into a logistics and operational partnership with Oyelaran Meridian Group. The contract renewal was, as it happened, scheduled for the following month. Miriam had personally signed the original agreement and was listed as the primary contact for renewal on every document in the airline's legal file. Derek knew this, or rather, he knew it now, at approximately the speed of someone watching their entire professional future reorganize itself in real time. He started. "I'd like my things," Miriam said quietly. She was looking at Thomas, not at Derek. Thomas turned to Derek. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Derek replaced the items in her bag. His hands were not entirely steady. The woman with the half-raised phone had lowered it, then raised it again. The junior staff member behind the counter was studying the floor very carefully. Thomas personally zipped the front pocket closed. He handed Miriam her boarding pass. He walked her to the gate. In the corridor, away from the line, she said to him, "How long has he been with you?" 7 years, Thomas said. "I see." "It won't be 8, he said. She nodded once. "See that it isn't." What people who weren't there later asked, when the account circulated, and it did circulate as these things do, first among the staff at that terminal and then slightly beyond, was whether Miriam Oyelaran said anything else to Derek Holloway. Whether she confronted him, dressed him down, made him answer for himself in front of the crowd he had performed his small cruelty to. She did not. That isn't how people like Miriam Oyelaran operate. They don't need to perform justice. They don't need to see you squirm and then announce that they made you squirm. They've been around long enough to know that consequence arrives on its own schedule. And your job is simply to be clear about what happened, to make sure the right people know, and then to get on your flight to Toronto. Which is exactly what she did. She ordered tea once she was on board. She opened her paperback to her bookmark, the one Derek had displaced when he'd rifled through her things. And she read for a while, and then she put the book down and looked out at the clouds over the Rockies, which were, as they often are at that time of morning, completely indifferent to everything that had just happened, and completely beautiful because of it. Derek Holloway was escorted off shift before the flight had even reached cruising altitude. The formal process took longer. These things always do. But the conversation with HR happened that afternoon, and the outcome was, in Thomas Achibi's own words in the report he filed, a clear case of policy violation, compounded by conduct unbecoming a supervisory role. The junior staff member, whose name was Priyanka, was asked if she had anything to add to the report. She said yes. She had been watching. She had noted the timestamps. She had, it turned out, raised a concern about Derek's conduct 6 months prior that had been logged but not adequately followed up on. That prior complaint was now part of the file. Priyanka was given a commendation at the end of the quarter. There's something I want to say here, because I think it matters. We talk a lot about moments of justice like this one. The whisper that changes everything, the reveal, the recognition. And sometimes the way we talk about them suggests that the lesson is about power, that Miriam won because she had a contract renewal in her back pocket, because Thomas Achibi knew her name, because she happened to be connected to someone important. But here's what I keep coming back to. She would have been right even if none of that were true. She would have been right if she were a retired teacher on a fixed income. She would have been right if she had never signed a single contract in her life. She would have been right if Thomas Achibi had walked past without stopping, and Derek Holloway had never been held accountable for a single thing he did that morning, because what he did was wrong before anyone whispered anything. It was wrong the moment he touched her bag without permission. It was wrong the moment he looked at an older black woman in a priority lane and decided she needed to be tested. It was wrong the first time, and the second time, and every time he had done something like this before. And there is no question in my mind that there was a before, because people who behave that way in front of witnesses on an ordinary Tuesday morning have had a great deal of practice behaving that way when no one important is watching. Dignity doesn't belong to people with contracts. It doesn't belong to people whose names show up in legal files. It belongs to Miriam Oyelaran. It belongs to every person who has ever stood in a queue and been made to feel like an inconvenience rather than a human being. The whisper mattered, because it woke Derek Holloway up to a consequence he could feel. But the wrong had happened long before the whisper, and the right had been right there, in Miriam's steady voice and her unmoving spine from the very beginning. She knew who she was. She knew it before Thomas Achibi said her name. She didn't need him to say it. That's the part I think about most. That she already knew. That she was already standing in it. Her own dignity, her own authority, like she had been standing in it her whole life. Through every hard year and every loss, and every small man who thought that age or exhaustion might have made her easier to dismiss. They never learn, some of them, until they have to, and then they learn very fast.